Live from Austin, Texas, I'm Charlie Lincoln with your co-host.
Andrea Antonescu from Rockville, Maryland. Welcome to another episode of the Charlie and Andrei Podcast. I know we've taken quite the hiatus, but we are back, baby. Better than
Yeah,
ever.
we're back. We're definitely back. It's been a while. We got things that we had to do, but some things have been done. And we're coming to you with probably a really cool episode that we've been talking about for a long time. I was at like this random charity event and somebody started talking to me about the Bogomils and he was like from central Greece and he said that he was potentially related to Bogomils and it was just something random and fascinating. So Andre and I started talking about it, and we also had some interest just reading up on Gnosticism and like the cosmology and duality of nature and the demiurge, and like how that relates to historical Christianity, kind of around the time of Venetius and everything, and the debates that were going on with the early church fathers, and how that kind of related to Platonic philosophy. We can sort of dip into that a little bit, but this podcast isn't really about like Gnosticism as such, more about like the Bogomils and the Cathars. So, Andre, do you want to tell us a little bit about those two
So
movements?
you may know, let's see, where should I start? Let's start with something that people might be familiar about in a humorous way. So have you heard of the word bugger that people
Yeah.
sometimes use, especially in Britain, like that bugger,
Yeah.
Well, it's used as a verb meaning to, sodomize, but it actually came to it originally referred to the members of this sect, the Cathars and the Bogomils. It was actually a corruption of the old French word bougre, which referred to Bulgarian, because that is one of the areas where the Bogomils, this sort of heretical Christian sect, was originally active, kind of near the Byzantine Empire and southeastern Europe. But it became just sort of a curse word, sort of like it also kind of related to the boogeyman. It's so obviously this sect has been kind of vilified over the centuries and taken on this sort of negative connotation, but its history is very fascinating, and you can really trace it back to, like, in some ways back to like things like Gnosticism, Zoroastrianism, early forms of early offshoots of that, like Manichaeism. Um, all of these things, what they had in common was an emphasis on duality, like a cosmic duality of sorts, in which there was a light and dark side that often opposed each other, but kind of worked together, and um, were essential for forces of nature. Uh, in Zoroastrianism, which is an ancient Iranian or Persian religion, it was Ahura Mazda, the being of light, supreme being, and Angra Minda, the evil one. And they kind of oppose each other. That was then transmitted to Manichaeism. The prophet Mani in like the 3rd century AD, he incorporated elements of Buddhism and Taoism, early Christianity, Jewish Gnosticism, and Zoroastrianism into this sort of syncretic faith or religion. And that was actually active on the fringes of the Roman Empire. From there, certain communities took some of these ideas and evolved them and changed them. And these sects were always kind of marginalized, but over time they survived and mutated and found their way into what became the Eastern Roman Empire. So before Bogomilism proper, you had something called Paulicianism, some guy named Paul in Armenia in the 7th century, and that before that was Marcionism and Simeonism and all these other sects. So there's like a long line on how it got to Bogomils. But yeah, they still had this sort of interesting emphasis on duality, which was not typical Christian fare. They did not use crucifixes or crosses. They kind of had a different emphasis on, to the point where it almost didn't seem like a proper type of Christianity at all, which is why it was heavily persecuted, in the Byzantine Empire. And I know,
Yeah, I mean, I'll
yeah,
pick up on that a little bit.
sure,
There's this idea in Gnosticism. It's kind of this like mystical tradition that builds off Platonic philosophy, and Platonic philosophy isn't like as such, religious, but in Plato's philosophy, there's this idea of the forms, which are kind of these eternal and unchanging archetypes where everything in the material world is kind of an imperfect copy, and what we experience are imperfect copies in this world.
hmm
Uh, and Gnosticism kind of takes that to a step fuller. They have like this idea of the pleroma and the hue, where it's like this idea of the whole, and it's like a concept of like a central understanding of everything, like all humanity, or like the Geist, in Hegelian thinking, that all the human soul as like the whole human soul of humanity and all of human society are built around these structures of duality. And they think that in like traditional Gnosticism that was like debated in the early Christian church, like there's this idea that the world was created by kind of an evil God, and Christ is like the good God who's coming to save us. And the early Christian church that sort of established itself in Rome and in Constantinople ultimately rejected a lot of that. But they believe deeply in like the logos, and they speak in their writings that are found in like the Nag Hammadi library or the Dead Sea Scrolls in like 1946 frequently talk about things like the logos that you would find in the book of Revelations. A lot of people say the book of Revelations by John is like a deeply Gnostic tradition. So these are just some highlights of kind of Gnostic thinking and philosophy. And as Andre mentioned, something popular in Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum, one of the key points of the plot is that there's this widespread secret of this mystic conspiracy that has its grounds in the disappearance of the Bogomils after the fall of the Second Bulgarian Empire under the Ottomans. So it's kind of like everything is connected. We're going to like early Christianity, which is connected to Plato, that is debated amongst the various councils of the Christian churches. And then it even like resurfaces, but then the Ottoman Empire gets rid of it. And of course, there's even modern novels like Umberto Eco talk about it a little bit. So that's kind of like just some background on Gnosticism.
Oh yeah, and like Gnosticism, that can potentially warrant its own entire separate episode. It's a very complex and nuanced topic with a lot of depth to it, and almost outside the scope of this podcast. But very fascinating for philosophy and I guess the belief system. Which actually kind of branched into numerous descendant forms and wasn't necessarily a unified set of ideas to begin with. But yeah, so Bogomilism, yeah, became established in the Balkans and Bulgaria. Again, it was never dominant, but it was an important force. And they didn't really build churches and things like that. They had strange dances and rituals that others were uncomfortable with, because they had this kind of dualist nature. And eventually they were gradually stamped out. Yes, they did last at some point until the Ottoman era there, but the bulk of them actually went westward, and their faith spread to what is now France, actually. And there it kind of transformed into Catharism. And eventually the Pope in the 13th century would launch a crusade of sorts called the Albigensian Crusade against these Cathars, these wicked heretics as he saw them. And he really like messed them up, though. Like he slaughtered them, by the thousands, and burned their towns and villages, and it got pretty bad. But they saw it as a threat to their power and the unity of the church. So did you have anything to add about like the Cathars in particular, and like France,
I
whatnot?
mean, it's interesting, like how it spread westward. Like, I looked at maps of how it spread westward. I think it went even up to like parts of Germany as well, and then back down to like France, and maybe even like Barcelona as
So
well.
yeah, Barcelona.
Um,
Yeah.
And I think that it also was like this heretical sect, the Paulicians that you had mentioned,
Coalitions,
were
yeah.
instrumental in spreading that as well. I think what's really interesting and fascinating to think about is the Cathars are mentioned in another Umberto Eco novel, The Name of the Rose, and he sort of hypothesizes that they're like kind of this pre-Protestant, uh, debate to Catholicism. Obviously, it didn't work out, right? But it's interesting to wonder like what would have been the future of Christianity had like they continued to be carried out and be successful. Um, like you said, the Pope, I guess in the 12th Crusade or in the 12th century, sent the Albigensian Crusade, and I
Yep.
think their main stronghold was Carcassonne, right?
Yeah, Carcassonne in Provence and in southern France. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Um,
the Inquisition was after them as well, right? And
that's
they like
right.
tortured
Yeah.
them and got like a lot of admissions of all sorts of crazy stuff, right?
Yeah, these guys were not popular with the authorities. Let's just put it that way. But I do think if their ideas caught on more and somehow became more mainstream, and by that I mean like if an important enough king or patron, like supported them and gave them legitimacy in some way, that is often kind of what it takes to make a religious sect more
But they
mainstream.
didn't get enough of that support,
Yeah,
basically.
they
That's what it
they
comes down
did. I
to.
mean, if you think about it, Christianity was once just like another, mystery cult or like,
Yeah.
religion, the Roman Empire, until it became adopted by Constantine, and then
And it's hypothesized that if like Martin Luther didn't get support of German princes, nobody would have cared. He would have like
yeah,
the movement would have
exactly.
died out. Yeah,
And
Protestant.
there was some political, calculation to that as well. It was the right time and the right place. It kind of all came together, um, because there were elements of proto-Protestantism that already tried to emerge in previous centuries that did not do as well. Um, but this whole Catharism, Bogomilism, Paulicianism, dualism, and it's kind of resurfaced. It's like a multi-headed creature that in some ways has been around for the majority of the Middle Ages in some form or another, and it keeps like kind of popping out. As soon as they think it's stamped out in one area, it shows up in another with a slightly kind of different form. So it's very interesting to trace like the history of all this.
I think part of it, and this is just I haven't read anything that suggests this, but part of it may be like you read the book of John and it's like in the beginning was the word and the word was with God and God was the word and it just seems like if you could try to read agnostic meaning to it, especially if you read the book of Revelation. So it's almost I mean, I've had people say like the book of Revelations is gnostic to me. I mean, I don't know. I don't know like
Yeah,
yeah, how to interpret that, but
the Book of Revelation is definitely the most like one of the most unique books in the Bible. It's
yeah.
different from the rest of them, and I think it was written by a different. I mean, John of Patmos, I guess, but they chose to include it because of its
When
power.
he was in captivity, right? And
Yeah,
yeah. And I mean there's a lot of symbolism and I guess like that's what the Cathars and the Bogomils really got on. Like you said, they didn't really care about the material world. They cared about symbolism and like things are so hard to articulate because it's abstract and
yeah.
therefore we use these symbols to communicate difficult ideas. So I mean it's interesting. And if you recall, Andre and I, we went to the Museum of the Bible, like somewhat recently, and there was this Protestant theologian there. I think his name was John Fox, and he suggested that the Cathars were like proto-Protestants, like you said, Andre. So it's always interesting to just draw these little tidbits
Yeah.
and these weaves through everything.
There's a lot of things that have been associated with sort of proto-Protestantism in a way. I mean, how even the what's it called, the iconoclast kind of movement within the Byzantine Empire has uh,
Yeah.
been, have some elements of that, and that they reject a lot of the pageantry of orthodoxy and the focus on like images and icons, and they were more about direct communion with God and simplicity and all that. But we can maybe talk about that in different podcasts. That's a whole other.
Although I would like to, this is a big tangent, probably the biggest for our podcast, this podcast so far, but there was even an iconoclasm in Bronze Age society with like Akhenaten and like, defacing Horus and Isis at like temples in Egypt. So, I mean, it has a tradition.
Oh yeah, I
It
know
may
for
be
sure.
part
It
of the
goes way
human
back.
condition.
Another interesting offshoot or possibly related group to these Bogomils and Paulicians and whatnot, the Athinganoi, which were a Manichaean sect like the rest of these, themselves a group of Simonians. They were active in Anatolia, and like the word for these people eventually became they became applied to like what we know as gypsies today, or the Roma people.
Mm.
They were neither Hebrews nor Gentiles, but they're not sure what their origin was. I think the word in Greek, like Athingani, well, doesn't it mean like not touchable, or like
Yeah, and that sounds like the untouchables in India, like in the
yeah.
Hindu caste system. And I had read that maybe like given that Alexander the Great's empires like Hellenism had reached India, that had sort of given the incentive for these Indo European peoples to kind of like migrate back to or I don't know if migrate back, but migrate to Europe,
Yeah,
part of the
yeah, it's very interesting because some studies actually describe that sect as remnants of the Indo-Greeks who left India in 400 AD during the migration period. And as you guys know, that was another podcast topic that we did a while back, if you follow us. So it's all kind of connected in a way. It's
It's all
fascinating.
connected, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so cool. Yeah, that the Indo-Greeks kind of maybe had like incentive to come back. And maybe that explains some of like the travels that the Bogomils and the Cathars took from like Bulgaria to go up to Germany and then down to France and like maybe Barcelona as well.
Yeah, exactly. So it's I mean, we could dig way kind of deeper into this, but this is just kind of skimming the surface and giving you like a broad overview of what this is all about.
And we could always take like a step back. There is like this injunction in the Bible to go spread the gospel. So it could be just like, hey, we have an interpretation of the gospel and we're going out there to spread it. You know what I mean? That type of thing.
That too. And of
Yep.
course, interpretations will always kind of change over time as they're spread, and the people talking about them inject their own ideas into it, and they gradually change. That's just how that's how ideas spread and morph.
Yeah.
Fascinating. It's
Yeah.
like a game of telephone in a way, if you know what I mean.
Oh, you can just imagine Game of Telephone. The Michael Sugru, there was a lecture by Michael Sugru on early
Yeah,
Christianity, if you recall. Unfortunately, he's passed away recently,
I
but
really like them. Yeah,
yeah, he was awesome. He said you can just imagine if you're playing a game of telephone explaining to a Roman like consul or emperor what Christianity is. It's like, what? They're sacrificing a baby, they're drinking blood, they're eating the body of the Savior. What? And you could easily misinterpret it as like these like terrible rituals of like human sacrifice.
yeah. It's yeah.
And that was all of history basically until the printing press, or at least for the most part, right?
Yep, exactly. No, that's actually a really good point. No, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, is there anything else we wanted to touch on?
I mean, dude, we could go to so many. We could talk about like how this is in the backdrop of the general crusades that were going to the Holy Land,
Yeah,
from like the 1000s, whenever Urban made his papal bull to like the 1200 late 1200s, like we said, proto-Protestantism. We could talk about, modern historiography. I mean, we could talk about the etymology of all this stuff, Gnosticism in general, and duality and the philosophy of Plato. So there's a lot of ideas, and it all relates to stuff we've done before, and like talked about Umberto Eco and the Indo-Greeks in Afghanistan, right?
oh yeah. But of course, you guys are free to research into this as much as you want and dig into it. If you have any requests for like other related topics, feel free to drop a message. But yeah, I think
We're
that
gonna
gets
try to do these more often. We
yeah,
took a little break, but we've just been doing a lot of research. That's
yeah,
our story, and we're sticking to it.
yeah. Let's go with that.
Yeah.
But yeah, all right, guys. It's been real. Glad to be back. And
Yep. Like,
yeah.
comment, and subscribe.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
This is Andre and Charlie signing off.
Signing off.
One.